The north is cold and full of whispers.
The castle smelled like preparation. Forge fires had burned for 3 days without stopping, and the smoke had soaked into the stone, into the mortar, into the wool of every cloak hanging by every door. Oiled leather and coal heat, and the cold, clean sharpness of freshly worked steel. Someone in the lower keep was still sharpening a blade, the rhythmic drag of whetstone on iron coming through the outer wall like a slow heartbeat. The torches burned in every tower, every window held light. Winterfell had never been so bright, and somehow that made the dark surrounding it heavier. 8,000 people waited inside these walls to die. Not all of them knew it that clearly. Some still spoke about holding the line, about the dragons, about the trench of fire Sansa had ordered dug at the tree line. But the ones who had looked north from the ramparts and counted what could not be counted moved with a particular quality of stillness. Not fear, something past fear. A kind of stripped-down honesty that comes when a person runs out of room to lie to themselves. They ate their meals. They checked their weapons. They sat with whoever they wanted to sit with. The usual pretenses had dropped. Rank had dropped. There was only the fire and whoever was close to it, and the hours between now and dawn. In the great hall, the fire that had burned the night before, when Jaime Lannister knelt and made Brienne of Tarth the first woman ever named to the Kingsguard, still roared in its hearth. Most of the hall had emptied. Servants moved along the walls, refilling cups without being asked. Tyrion Lannister sat at the end of a long table with a cup of wine he had been nursing for 45 minutes. He was not drunk. That was the tell, for anyone who knew him. A rider had come in through the north gate an hour ago. The message was short. The white advance had stopped. The army, 100,000 dead things that should have been moving forward through the dark, closing the distance, had halted 3 miles from the walls at dusk and had not moved since. Stationary, silent, the scouts who confirmed it had ridden the length of the formation twice. Not a trick of darkness, not a gap in the line. The dead had simply stopped. Tyrion turned the cup in his hands. He had run the question from every angle he owned, and none of the angles made sense. Dead things didn't make tactical decisions. The Night King did. And a general who holds an army outside the range of effective dragon fire at nightfall is a general who has thought carefully about what dragons do to a formation in the dark. That kind of thinking implied patience. Patience implied purpose. Purpose implied something beyond the simple grinding advance he had been bracing for all week. He lifted the cup, paused it against his lip, did not drink. Jon Snow found Bran in the Godswood. He had expected him where he always was now, in the chair, in the open air, the heart tree somewhere in his eyeline. He was. But the chair had been moved close enough that the low-hanging branches caught the moonlight around his shoulders, and his eyes were white. Had been white for some time by the look of him. Entirely still, not the stillness of someone being careful, an absence. Jon waited. He was good at waiting. The wall had made him that. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched his brother's face and said nothing. He counted the trees by sound, wind through bare branches, the soft movement of old roots settling. No steel, no voices. The Godswood absorbed noise the way deep snow did, completely, without returning it. Bran came back slowly. The white bled out of his eyes. He blinked and looked at Jon with that expression that had replaced the one Jon remembered, the open, eager face of the boy who used to climb every tower in Winterfell. This one gave nothing away, because it held everything equally. Joy and grief and exhaustion all weighted the same. "I looked north," Bran said. Jon crouched to put himself at the boy's eye level. His knees ached. He was 23 years old, and his knees ached from cold and stone. "What did you see?" A pause, long enough that Jon thought he wasn't going to answer. The wind moved. A branch tapped another branch once, twice, then settled. "What was always there?" Bran said. He was not lying. Jon understood that much. Bran had moved beyond lying the same way he'd moved beyond climbing. The thing he'd been before simply wasn't available anymore. He was answering with perfect accuracy. The North held what the North had always held. The White Army stood where it stood. The dead were coming. What was always there was exactly what Bran had found. The Night King was not north anymore. He had left 6 hours ago. Jon didn't know that. He crouched in the godswood and looked at his brother and tried to read something in the face that offered nothing, and eventually he stood and said he'd better get back. Bran said nothing. Jon walked toward the lights of the keep. They found each other on the battlements above the east gate. That was where Daenerys had gone when the hall grew too full, not because she feared being seen, but because the inside of Winterfell, beautiful as its people had become to her, was not her register. She thought better in open air, above things. Jon found her there and chose to stay. They stood with the cold moving past them from the north, and the torches burning orange below, and the dark spreading in every direction beyond the walls. "Are you afraid?" she asked. He thought about lying. The Jon who had taken the black at 14 would have said no with a deliberate flatness he'd learned to pass for conviction. He'd spent years performing fearlessness at the wall because the watch needed him to. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She was still looking north. "I am too. I thought I would be past it by now. After everything. I thought fear would run out eventually." "It doesn't run out," he said. "It just gets quieter." She turned to look at him. In the torchlight she looked very young and very old at the same time, the way people looked when they had seen enough. He wanted to tell her what he knew about himself. He had been circling it for weeks, orbiting the truth Bran had given him like a man approaching a fire from the cold, grateful for the light, not yet ready for the heat. He said nothing. There was a war in the morning. The truth could wait one more night. She put her hand on the stone. He put his hand over hers. That was all. They stayed there until the torchlight started jumping in a changed wind, and then they went inside. The second rider came in at midnight. He had ridden his horse into the ground over the last mile. The animal was bleeding from the mouth when it stopped moving in the courtyard, taking 3 stumbling steps past the gate before its legs went. The rider dropped from the saddle, caught himself against a post, and had to be held upright by 2 guards. Jon reached him in 4 minutes. Tyrion in 6. The report came out in pieces, in the wrong order, but the shape of it was clear enough. The White Army had not moved. Moreover, it was smaller than the estimates. The White Walker lieutenants were not visible in the formations. Scouting passes had found no trace of the Night King's position in the column. The Sirion had not been sighted anywhere along the northern approaches. "Something is wrong," Tyrion said. Quietly, without dramatics, the way he said things he was already certain of. Jon looked at the map, then looked up. "Send to Bran. I want him looking for the Night King, not the army, the Night King himself." "The battle was planned for dawn," one of the garrison commanders said. "If we change the deployment now, the Night King has already changed it." Tyrion said, "We are simply waiting to find out how." They called a strategy session for an hour before first light. Messages went to the garrison commanders, to the dragon handlers, to the scouts still in the field. Jon walked the ramparts twice himself, looking north at the dark where 50,000 dead things stood against the tree line without moving. The battle was supposed to begin at dawn. Dawn came gray and ordinary, defenders at their posts, arrows nocked, torches guttering in the early light. The White Army stood against the northern tree line like a painting of a nightmare, absolutely still, absolutely patient, generating no warmth and requiring none. Jon stood on the rampart above the gate and watched it and felt something he did not yet have a name for move through his chest. He did not know what the Night King had done. He did not know that 1,800 miles to the south, beneath a different sky, blue fire was illuminating a harbor district. He did not know that the Night King had been flying for 6 hours, that a city of 1 million people had 28 hours left. In the godswood, Bran sat beneath the heart tree with white eyes and still hands. Somewhere south, very far south, a single raven was flying as fast as its wings would carry it, down the King's Road, over the neck, past the Twins, toward the Riverlands. He watched it go through borrowed eyes. The world below was small and dark and fast. The distant horizon where King's Landing had always been was beginning to glow. He did not call the raven back. Cersei Lannister stood at the window of her bedchamber and looked north, and she allowed herself to feel it, the low, clean warmth of being right. The night was clear. The stars over the Blackwater Rush were sharp and still. Below her, King's Landing breathed in the particular way it breathed at this hour, 1,000,000 people folded inward. The roar of the daytime city reduced to its lowest register, a drunk singing somewhere in the Street of Silver, a dog barking twice and stopping, the distant creak of ship timber in the harbor. The city did not sleep so much as pause. It had always come back, whatever fire and flood and siege had done to it across 300 years. King's Landing had always reassembled itself around the Red Keep and begun again. She was wearing her robe, her hair was loose, she had poured wine she didn't particularly want because she couldn't sleep, and the cup sat half empty on the table behind her, and she had not thought about it in 20 minutes. She was thinking about the North. The North, where the dead were supposed to be advancing on Winterfell tonight. The North, where Daenerys Targaryen had committed her dragons and her Unsullied, and her Dothraki, and the Snowboy with his Valyrian steel sword to a battle Cersei had declined to attend. She had sent the Golden Company instead. 20,000 professional soldiers on the shores of Westeros, holding the line she actually cared about while the people who wanted her throne spent themselves against a dead army in the cold. She had done the calculation with greater clarity than any of them had given her credit for. Let them fight the dead. Let the dead cost them. Whatever emerged from Winterfell, living or otherwise, would find Cersei Lannister on her throne with fresh soldiers at her back, and they would begin again. She touched her belly, once, with the flat of her hand, then she let her hand drop and looked at the harbor. She was still looking at it when the temperature changed. She noticed it the way you notice a candle going out in a room. Not the darkness itself, but the shift in air. 3 degrees. Maybe 4. The warmth the city generated even at night, forge heat, cook-fire residue, the collective warmth of 1,000,000 bodies, simply receded. The hairs on her arms rose beneath the silk. She did not yet understand what she was feeling. In Flea Bottom, Lana had been awake for 3 hours. The baby had colic. She had tried everything she knew, which was everything her mother had tried. Which was everything her grandmother had tried. None of it working, all of it exhausting. She had the baby against her shoulder and was walking the length of the one room she shared with her husband and her husband's mother. 11 steps in one direction. Turn. 11 steps back. The room smelled like damp wood and old cook fire, and the particular sourness of unwashed wool that never fully aired out this close to the bay. The alley outside her window was 4 feet wide. On the other side of it, 4 feet away, another wall of another tenement, housing another family doing another version of the same night. The baby stopped crying. Lana noticed it because she had been bracing for the next surge. They came in waves. 10 minutes of screaming, 5 minutes of quiet, another wave, and the quiet had come early. She patted the baby's back automatically. She looked at the window, which was a small rectangle of black, barely distinguishable from the wall around it. From the alley, a dragging sound. Low, rhythmic, something moving slowly on wet stone. Not footsteps, not the 2 beat of a person walking. Something with the wrong number of points of contact. She stood still and listened to it move past the base of the wall below her window. Then, past. Then, gone. She did not go to the window. She kept patting the baby's back. She told herself it was a dog. Then, the harbor turned blue. It was not lightning. Lightning was white and instant and gone. This was sustained. A column of cold blue illumination rising from somewhere near the eastern docks, holding for 4 full seconds, then sweeping. The light came through the window and lit the whole room the color of deep water. Lana's husband woke and said her name. His mother woke and said nothing. Lana looked at the window. From the direction of the harbor, someone started to scream, and then the screaming stopped. Qyburn had not slept. He rarely did in the final watch of the night. His mind ran on a different schedule than most men, most productive in the hours when the rest of the Red Keep was quiet. He was in his workroom when the first report reached him. Brought by a guard whose face had gone the specific pale of a man who has seen something he cannot file. "Dragon," the man said. "From the north. Over the harbor. Blue fire." Qyburn put down the instrument he was holding. He thought for exactly 4 seconds. Then he moved. He had studied the wight they had captured. He knew the mechanics. He knew what fire did to them, and what it did not do. He had been preparing a recommendation for Cersei for 3 weeks, and had not delivered it because she had not asked. She would ask now. He went to her chambers. She was already awake, already at the window, watching the eastern sky where the blue light had appeared, and spread, and moved. "Your Grace." He stopped beside her, looked at what she was looking at. The harbor district was partially visible from this angle, rooftops and the suggestion of streets, and now a rising glow. Not fire, the wrong color for fire. "We need to trigger the caches." She did not look at him. What caches? The wildfire. What remains of the Mad King's network beneath the city? The Street of Steel. The old Dragon Pit district. The tunnels under the harbor. He kept his voice at the level he used when he wanted her to hear him as a physician rather than as a subordinate. Factual, precise, without affect. "If we burn the city now, before the outbreak saturates the population, we deny the enemy his army. Ash cannot be raised. It is the only mathematically sound response." Cersei turned from the window slowly. She looked at him. "You are asking me," she said, "to burn my city. I am asking you to make it unavailable to the enemy. Yes, this is my city. Your Grace, I am the Queen." Her voice was not loud. It was very controlled. "I did not hold this throne through 2 sieges and a war and 3 dead children to burn the ground it sits on, because someone told me the mathematics required it." She turned back to the window. "Find another answer." He was quiet for a moment. There was no other answer, and they both understood that. He allowed the silence to carry the weight that words would not have shifted. Then, before he turned to go, he said, "The mountain fell an hour ago. Whether he rises again under different auspices I cannot say. That is outside my experience." Cersei said nothing. She kept looking at the harbor. Qyburn bowed and left, and began thinking about what came next, because something always came next, and someone had to be thinking about it. Flea Bottom died in sections. The alleys that made the district impossible to navigate by daylight made it perfect hunting ground in the dark. The harbor wights moved inland in a wave that had no front line. They came through every gap simultaneously, every alley mouth, every collapsed archway, every passage too narrow for a grown man to walk through without turning sideways. The residents of the northern tenements heard the sounds before they saw anything, that wet, dragging, wrong-footed rhythm on cobblestone. Too many points of contact, the wrong tempo for anything living. The potshops were still warm. The fires in them caught the dead when they entered, slowing some, not stopping them. The narrow rooms filled fast. 1 body became 5. 5 became 30. The mathematics Qyburn had presented to Cersei playing out in the streets below with absolute indifference to whether she had accepted them or not. The sound changed as it progressed. The screaming was brief each time. The dead were efficient. What replaced it was worse. The footsteps, just the footsteps, multiplying, spreading outward through the district's veins. Cersei came to the rampart without being summoned. She had put on her queen's dress. She had done her hair. She had taken the time, a deliberate, conscious investment of time, to present herself correctly, and she stood now at the outer rampart of the Red Keep with her hands at the stone and watched Flea Bottom. She watched the glow spreading through the lower city streets, the blue-white light moving with the logic of floodwater, filling the lowest points first. Moving by gravity through any open channel. She watched it reach the Street of Sisters and stop there a moment, backing up, then continue. Qyburn stood 2 feet to her left. He said nothing. She had not asked him a question. The screaming from Flea Bottom had stopped 20 minutes ago. The district that housed 150,000 people was generating no sound now except that one continuous soft movement. 1,000,000 dead feet on cobblestone, spreading, ordering themselves, beginning to face outward. The silence it replaced was the loudest thing Cersei had ever heard. She stood straight. She kept her hands still on the stone. She did not run. She did not call for anyone. There was no one to call. And she was who she was, and she would not perform fear for the empty air. She turned from the rampart and walked back toward the throne room, with the same deliberate pace she had used to walk into every room in which she'd ever needed to appear unafraid. Behind her, Flea Bottom was gone. The city was going. The night had barely started. By the time the sun rose over Blackwater Bay, Flea Bottom was finished. The Street of Sisters went next. Then the harbor district proper, the rope walks and the sailmakers' yards, and the fish markets that began setting up at 3, and because the catches came in before dawn. The wights moved through the market stalls without disturbing a single crate. They had no interest in fish. They moved with purpose, which was worse than if they'd moved randomly. Because purpose meant direction, and direction meant someone was directing them. The Street of Flour held 40,000 people and enough grain to feed the city through a 3-month siege. None of it mattered. The bakers who had been awake since midnight preparing the morning's bread died at their ovens. The grain sat in its stores. The fresh loaves cooled on their racks in empty rooms while the district's population redistributed itself into the city's new configuration. No longer citizens, no longer anything with a name. Simply more. By the time gray light reached the rooftops, the eastern half of King's Landing below the Street of Steel belonged to the dead. On Rhaenys's Hill, 8,000 men were still alive. The Golden Company had deployed on the hill's slopes before midnight. Harry Strickland had made one correct decision in the whole of that night, moving his infantry to high ground the moment the harbor lit blue. He was not a battlefield commander, but he understood terrain, and the slope gave his shield wall an angle of advantage over anything climbing toward them. He had positioned his veterans on the flanks, his cavalry in a second line, and the horses that hadn't bolted from the dragon smell were holding. The shield wall held for 2 hours. That was remarkable. Worth saying plainly because easy deaths and fast collapses make bad history, these men held for 2 hours against an assault that had no logical endpoint, against an enemy that produced more soldiers every time one of them fell. The mercenaries locked shields and braced, and held the line with the mechanical discipline of men who had trained this specific formation for years. They lost ground slowly, 10 feet at a time, then 15, fighting for every yard of slope. The dead could not be demoralized. The living compensated with technique, with formation, with everything their training had given them. Then the elephants came. There were 6 of them. The Golden Company's elephants had survived the crossing from Essos, massive gray animals, each one carrying memories of 3 campaigns in the summer heat of Essos, trained to trumpet on command and to break infantry lines by weight and momentum alone. They had died in the first hour, driven into the white formations by panicking handlers who thought living animals could anchor a line against dead ones. They could not. The dead did not slow for animals. The elephants died, and the Night King's reach extended, and the elephants rose. A dead elephant does not trumpet. It moves in absolute silence, which was the first wrong thing the soldiers noticed. 6 tons of animal moving uphill without a sound. The line had been bracing for a cavalry charge on the flanks. Standard response, practiced, deployable. Nobody had a standard response for 6 tons of dead animal that could not feel the spears going into it and would not stop when it bled, because it was not bleeding, it was just leaking. And the distinction did not slow it at all. The shield wall that had held 2 hours against 10,000 wights broke in under 4 minutes when the first elephant hit it. The formation folded at the point of impact, and the dead poured through the gap before the flanks could close. Harry Strickland was dead before the second elephant reached the line. He had been trying to reach his horse. He almost made it. The 8,000 men of the Golden Company had died as well as it was possible to die against something that could not be killed by dying. Beneath the Street of Steel, 3 hours after dawn, Viserion landed. The street was wide by King's Landing standards, wide enough for a full cart with room on both sides, the width dictated by centuries of iron workers needing to move equipment in and out of the smithies that lined both sides from the harbor up to Aegon's high hill. Viserion folded his wings and the blue fire came in sustained bursts along the storefronts, and somewhere in the third burst. The heat reached a depth it had no business reaching. The stone beneath the street contained something that stone should not contain. The explosion was green. It went up through the roadway in a column first, then outward, a widening ring of green-white fire that moved faster than fire had any right to move. 3,000 wights within the initial radius ceased to exist in the space of 2 seconds. The chain ignition moved north along the street of steel as connected tunnels carried the flame to adjacent caches. More columns. More rings. The sound reached the slopes of Rhaenys' Hill as a series of concussions spread 45 seconds apart, and what remained of the Golden Company's survivors heard it and looked south and saw the green glow, and some of them started shouting because green fire killed the dead. They'd seen it. The city was fighting back. Something was turning. The soldiers saw the Night King enter the far edge of the wildfire column. They watched him walk into the green flame. They waited. For the scream, for the collapse, for anything that said the fire had found him the way it found everything else. He walked out the other side. Whether the flame moved around him or simply failed to hold, none of the men who saw it could agree afterward. What they agreed on was this: the green fire that had killed thousands in a breath left him unchanged. He did not slow. He did not look down at himself. He continued walking toward the hill with the same ancient patience he had carried into every street in the city, and the soldiers on the slope above him stopped cheering and said nothing at all. Cersei had moved twice since leaving the rampart. First to the small council chamber, where she had stood in front of the map table and looked at it for a few minutes before accepting that a map was of no use in a situation this complete. Then up, higher, to the topmost inhabited tower of the Red Keep, above even her own bedchamber. There was a room there she had used sometimes to think, looking down at the city on the days when the city felt like something that belonged to her. A small room, one window facing west, one facing south. She stood at the southern window now with a cup of wine. Not the same cup from earlier, she had refilled it somewhere along the way. Her hair was still correct. She was still in her queen's dress. These were choices. She understood them as choices. From this height, the full shape of it was visible. The eastern city was gone, not destroyed in any structural sense, the building stood. But the living content of it was gone, replaced by something that moved in organized patterns she could see from up here, the way you see patterns in water from a cliff. The Golden Company position on Rhaenys' Hill was collapsing. The wildfire columns had burned out, leaving green, scorched craters across the Street of Steel district that the wights were already moving around and through without difficulty. Viserion circled the harbor, not attacking now, just present. Keeping the exits closed, she looked down at her hand, holding the cup. Completely steady. She was interested in that, the way the body keeps its basic competencies even when the mind is doing something else entirely. She held her other hand against her belly for the last time. One breath. Then she put both hands on the windowsill and looked south at the Blackwater Rush, where the water was catching the full morning sun and doing the thing it did sometimes. Throwing light back up at the sky as if the river were trying to return it. She had always liked that. The door behind her broke inward at the third strike. She did not turn around. The Night King moved through the city he had taken in sections and stages, district by district through streets that had become his. He did not move passively. At each intersection, at the edge of each neighborhood, he stopped. He raised his arms, both of them, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone performing something that required intention, and the cold light around him brightened for a moment, and the bodies in the surrounding streets that had not yet risen rose. He moved on. He did this at intervals as he walked, methodically working through the city the way a man works, through any task that requires attention and repetition, each pause marking another section claimed. The dead did not require instruction beyond this. They felt the direction of his purpose and faced it. He walked up the road of the hand toward the Red Keep. The great steps were wide enough for 30 men abreast. He climbed them alone. The throne room doors stood open. No guards, no ceremony, the wood pushed wide by the draft that came through the blown-out windows above. The room was enormous and smelled of cold stone and the particular mineral smell of the ash that had settled from Viserion's earlier passes. The morning light came in sideways through the high windows and caught the dust still moving in the air. The Iron Throne was in its corner of the room, on the dais where 300 years of kings and regents and usurpers had sat and sorted the world according to their preferences. One arm had begun to droop. The heat from Viserion's pass had reached the iron and found it willing. and the drooping arm had taken some of the surrounding swords with it, fusing them into a slumping mass that no longer resembled anything forged with intention. The throne had always been uncomfortable. It was now also incomplete. The Night King stood before it. He was completely still for a long time. Long enough that if anything had been watching, it might have imagined something like consideration, some process running behind those blue eyes that might, if translated into human terms, resemble thought. He turned away. He walked to the shattered eastern window and stood in it, looking out over the city that spread below him to the harbor and the bay and the open sea beyond. On every rampart, in every window, on every dock and rooftop and open street, blue eyes, all of them facing south. The harbor held silent ships. The flea-bottom alleys held no sound. The street of flowers' fresh bread was still cooling in the empty bakeries. 1,000,000 people. The largest army ever assembled in the history of the world stood in a walled city on the coast of Westeros and waited. As their king waited, for whatever came next. The living population of King's Landing at full dawn was 0. 3 days of waiting had done something to the defenders that the expected battle would not have. A battle could be survived or not survived, and the body understood that, and prepared accordingly, the narrowing of vision. The strange calm that came in the last minutes before steel met steel, the way the mouth went dry and the hands went steady. The body had protocols for violence. It did not have protocols for this. For standing at a post in the cold, with your weapon in your hand for 72 hours, while 50,000 dead things stood at the tree line and did absolutely nothing. For waking up on the 4th morning and finding them exactly where they'd been on the 1st. For eating half rations in rotating shifts and sleeping in your armor, and counting the torches on the outer wall, because counting was something to do with your mind, while your mind tried to find the shape of a threat that refused to behave like one. The horses had started to go strange on day 2. Not frightened, the direwolves and dragons had long since forced a renegotiation of what frightened meant for animals inside Winterfell's walls. Something else. They stood in their stalls without eating, and oriented toward the north with their ears laid flat, and their eyes showing white at the edges, hour after hour, the way animals behave when they feel a pressure that has no visible source. Jon had walked the ramparts twice in the dark on each of the 4 nights. The White Army did not move. The White Walker lieutenants were not visible anywhere in the formation. Dany had taken Drogon up on day 2 and circled the entire army at altitude. She came back and said the same thing the scouts had said. 50,000, stationary. The Night King not among them. Bran had confirmed it on day 1 in the Godswood, and then Bran had gone quiet in the way he sometimes went quiet, which meant either that he was looking at something important or that he had decided the question was no longer the right one. Tyrion had stopped sleeping on day 3. He sat in the war room with the map and moved pieces that had no business being moved, and put them back and moved them again. The raven came in at first light on day 4. It came from the south, which was the first wrong thing. Ravens from beyond the wall came from the north. Ravens from Castle Black, from the Night's Watch, from the northern lords, came from the south and west. But this one came from due south, and it came badly. Erratic flight, altitude dropping and recovering, the wings not quite synchronized the way they should be. It cleared the outer wall by 6 feet and landed on the maester's tower with a hard thump that knocked it sideways before it caught the ledge. The maester on duty caught it before it fell. Its feathers were singed. Not at the tips, singed at the quills, close to the body, the way feathers go when they pass through heat, not past it. The scroll was tiny, cramped writing, the ink pressed too hard, the letters leaning forward like a man walking into wind. Whoever had written it had been writing with shaking hands, or writing fast, or both. 8 words. The raven died 10 minutes after delivery. It simply folded onto its side on the table where the maester had placed it, and was still. Tyrion read the note twice, standing in the doorway of the war room where the runner had brought it. He read it the first time with the part of his mind that processed language. He read it the second time with the part that processed meaning. Then he set it flat on the map table and looked at the place on the map where King's Landing sat at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, and he said, "He bypassed us." Quietly. Without surprise in his voice, not because he had expected it, but because the part of him that was still capable of surprise was currently occupied with something that felt like a wall coming down somewhere inside his chest. He bypassed us. That was the answer to the 4-day stillness. That was why the Night King's lieutenants were absent. That was what the motionless white army was. A door held open to keep your attention while something moved through a window. He had not seen it. He had run every scenario he owned for 4 days and not seen it. He did not say that out loud. He folded his hands on the map table and looked at the 8 words and waited for the others to arrive. Sansa read the note standing. She read it once and handed it back and sat down very slowly in the nearest chair, the way a person sits when their legs have made a decision before their mind has caught up. Her face did the thing it had learned to do in King's Landing years ago. It went still and correct and gave away exactly nothing. Beneath that stillness, the part of her that had spent years calculating alliances and bloodlines and the mechanics of political leverage was running through the implications at speed, and what it was finding at every turn was the same thing. Every alliance restructured around Southern power. Every calculation about who would hold the Iron Throne. Every conversation about which lords would bend the knee and to whom. All of it built on a foundation that had been sitting in a dead city for 3 days before the note even left. How many people? Not a question. She knew the answer. 1 million, Tyrion said. Approximately. She nodded once and said nothing else. Jon went outside. He went through the door of the war room and through the corridor and out through the east gate without stopping. He walked to the outer rampart and stood there looking north at the White Army in the dawn light. 50,000 dead things, organized and stationary and patient. He looked at them for a long time. He understood suddenly and completely that they were never going to attack. They were a fence. They had always been a fence, not an assault force, a containment measure. Something to keep his attention fixed north, while the actual movement happened 1,800 miles away in the dark. He had been outmaneuvered by something that operated at a scale he was only now beginning to grasp. Not faster, not stronger. Older, something that thought across distances and timelines that made his best planning look like a child arranging stones. He came back inside after 10 minutes. His face was composed. Arya was already preparing to leave when he found her. She had her pack on the floor of the armory and was moving through it with methodical speed, the way she moved through everything, efficiently, without wasted motion, making decisions so fast they looked like instinct. Jon stood in the doorway and she said, without looking up, "I'm going south. The Night King has 1 million soldiers now," he said. "He's still one man." She pulled a strap tight. "One man with 1 life to lose. I don't need an army. I need a door." He did not argue with the logic because the logic was not wrong. He argued with it anyway, the way you argue with correct logic when the person proposing it is your blood and you are afraid for them. She listened to him with complete patience and continued packing. In the dragon yard, Dany stood alone with Drogon's head in her hands. The dragon lowered to let her reach him, which he did for very few people. She was not crying. She was past whatever the earlier stage of this had been. The city she had spent her life believing was her birthright, the city her father had ruled, that her family had built from the first stone of the Red Keep outward, had been dead for 3 days before she learned about it. The Iron Throne sat in a city of 1 million corpses. The people she had crossed a sea and lost half her army and given years of her life to save were past saving by the time she knew they needed it. She pressed her forehead against Drogon's scales. His warmth came through in a wave, and she stayed there for a moment, just feeling it. The council that followed was the shortest on record. The questions were direct and the answers were worse. The Golden Company was dead and risen. Euron's fleet, unknown. Anyone living in the south, unknown. Time before the dead could march north and begin harvesting the riverlands. Tyrion estimated 19 days on foot, less if the Night King moved them by ship. What ships? Any ships. The harbor was full of them. Jon found Bran in the Godswood afterward. He stopped in front of the chair and looked at his brother, at the face that had learned to hold everything equally, and said, "Did you know?" Not a question. The same way Sansa had asked about the number. The wind moved through the heart tree. The red sap in the carved face caught a thin line of morning sun. "I saw many things," Bran said. "I cannot see everything at once." Jon looked at him for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and did not have a clean name. He made a decision whether to believe this or to accept that the answer did not change anything that needed doing. Then he said, "I need to know where the Night King went. Inside the city. Where he is now." Bran's eyes went white. Jon waited. A minute passed. 2. The wind in the heart tree was the only sound. Bran came back. "The throne room," he said. He walked to the red keep and stood before the throne and looked at it. Then he turned away. "He has been there since the city fell. He is there now." "Has he left it?" "No." Jon held that for a moment. Then he walked away, back toward the castle, carrying the knowledge Bran had given him the same way he carried most things Bran gave him, useful and cold and slightly wrong in a way he could not articulate. Bran watched him go. In the south, somewhere over the Trident, a raven that Bran had been watching through borrowed eyes was losing altitude. It had been flying for 3 days. It had delivered its 8 words and died on a table in a maester's tower in Winterfell. Bran had watched a second raven take the same southward route 2 hours before the first one arrived. He had watched it through the heart tree's network, a small dark shape moving fast over the neck, dropping toward the riverlands. He had not called it back either. The flotilla was 34 ships. Theon had counted them twice, from the cliff path above the cove, and the number did not improve on second count. Fishing vessels, most of them, the deep-keeled northern type built for the cold gray waters of the Bight, wide in the beam and low on speed, designed to stay upright in rough water while men hauled nets. 3 supply barges that had been carrying grain and siege equipment down from White Harbor when the breakout order reached the King's Road. 1 genuine warship, a single-masted cog flying no house colors, which someone had commandeered from a coastal lord who was no longer in a position to dispute the commandeering. 34 ships. 7,400 people. He did not work out the ratio because working it out was not useful. He stood on the cliff path with the wind coming off the Bight in long cold gusts and looked at the vessels riding at anchor in the cove below and understood with the clarity that came from having spent his entire childhood watching his father's men calculate tonnage and capacity that 34. Ships of this size could move perhaps 1,200 people with any kind of safety margin, could move 2,000 if you packed them badly and accepted the risk, could move 7,400 only as a theoretical exercise in how many bodies could be stacked before hulls went under. Davos came to stand beside him on the path. The old man looked at the flotilla for a moment, and then looked at Theon. "You're doing the math," Davos said. "I've done the math." "And?" "Not enough." Theon looked at the gray water. "Not close to enough. Even if we had the ships, the Bight is not a friendly sea in this season. A full war fleet moves carefully through here. 34 fishing vessels moving at speed with 3 times their safe capacity." He stopped. "Some would make it." "How many is some?" Theon said nothing. Davos nodded as if he had answered. The camp below them stretched along the coastal shingle, 7,400 people who had outrun the White Distraction Force through a burning corridor in the early morning and marched for 18 hours without stopping. They had fires going, which was a risk, but the alternative was hypothermia, and the dead didn't need their scouts' attention drawn. They were sleeping in shifts. They were exhausted in the specific way that follows sustained terror, not tired, exactly, but emptied. Moving on the habit of movement, because the habit was all that was left. The rowboat came in an hour before midday. One of the sentries on the shore spotted it first, a small shape moving badly, oars working out of rhythm. The stroke of someone whose arms were failing. Theon went down to the waterline himself. The man in the rowboat was alive, but it required a moment's attention to confirm it. He had been burned across his left side, not deeply, but extensively, the kind of burn that covered area rather than depth, the kind you got from proximity to something that was briefly very hot. His right hand was the one doing the rowing, his left was held against his body. They pulled him out of the boat. He sat on the shingle and breathed for a while before he could speak. He had been a deckhand on the Silence, Euron's flagship. He told it in pieces, in the wrong order, the way people tell things when the experience is still happening to them internally, even though it has externally ended. 3 nights ago. Operating west of King's Landing in coastal waters per Lord Euron's standing orders to intercept any vessel attempting flight from the capital. The night was clear. Good visibility. No warning, not enough warning, half a warning, the shadow of something enormous crossing the stars above the mainmast, and then the blue fire hitting the deck of the ship to their port side, and the ship going dark. Not burning, not the orange fire you run from and sometimes survive, just blue light, and then the ship going silent, and then the crew of that ship standing up again. He rode for 3 days. He did not know where he was going. He was going away from what was behind him. Jon crouched in front of him on the shingle and asked about Euron. The man shook his head. He had seen Lord Euron on deck when it started. He had not seen Lord Euron after. He had been in the water by then. They gave the man water and a blanket. He sat holding the blanket and looking at the stones. The Iron Fleet was 64 warships, the finest fighting vessels in Westeros, purpose-built for speed and aggression, crewed by Ironborn who had spent their lives at sea. Euron had spent years and more gold than any lord should have been able to access building it into the weapon it was. It was the thing he had offered Cersei that no one else could match. Not soldiers, not coin, but maritime supremacy. Control of the coasts, control of the supply routes, control of who moved and who didn't between any 2 points accessible by water. The Night King now had a navy. Tyrion received the information in the same way he received information he had been dreading, but had half constructed in his mind already, not with surprise, but with the grim recognition of a shape he'd already partially drawn. He sat with it for a few minutes. Then he called Jon and Theon and Davos to the flat rock above the cove that had become their planning surface and laid out what it meant. "We cannot go by sea," he said. "The Iron Fleet has been dead for 3 days. In that time, by conservative estimate, it has moved south along the coast and is currently positioned somewhere between the mouth of the Mander and the Blackwater Rush. If we load these 34 ships and head south, we meet 64 warships crewed by things that require no sleep and feel no cold, and do not worry about weather." He looked at the map he'd unrolled on the rock, held flat at the corners by stones. "The sea is closed." "Overland, then," Jon said. "Overland south leads to King's Landing. Overland south and east leads to King's Landing via a longer route. Overland south and west leads to the Westerlands, intact, as far as we know, but Lannister territory and no welcome for us there regardless of everything else." Tyrion put his finger on the map, moving it inland from their coastal position, following the lower fork of the Trident upriver. "Here, inland, the Trident River system runs through the heart of the Riverlands, and the roads along it are passable in this season. We move on foot, along the river, southeast toward the Ruby Ford. We stay off the King's Road, too visible, too exposed, and the dead may already be running scouts north from the city along it. We move through country." "That route adds 4 days, Davos said. "Yes, 4 days on a route the dead don't currently control, versus 2 days on a route where 64 warships can intercept a fishing fleet." Tyrion folded the map. "I find myself preferring 4 days. They told the camp an hour later. The soldiers took it the way soldiers take tactical retreats that are obviously necessary but feel like failure, with quiet compliance and no particular enthusiasm. The civilians took it the way civilians take news that the situation is worse than it was this morning, with the kind of stillness that comes when you have already absorbed so much that new additions don't register as discrete events anymore, just as further confirmation of a general truth about how things were going. They began moving within 2 hours. In the open water a mile off the coast, Euron Greyjoy sat in a lifeboat and watched his fleet circle. The Silence was out there. He could see her from here, the black hull, the distinctive lines of the largest ship he had ever commissioned, the ship he had named after the thing he had taken from everyone who sailed her. She moved with the current, maintaining a loose ring around the position his lifeboat occupied. She was not approaching. None of the 64 ships were approaching. They move the way things move when they are waiting for instruction and the instruction has not yet arrived. The dead crewing them had no interest in Euron Greyjoy. He had spent his entire life in the business of being impossible to ignore. He had killed his brother for a throne. He had crossed seas and made alliances with queens and built fleets from nothing and cut off Yara's rescue fleet in a night engagement that the histories would have called one of the great naval operations of the modern era. He had offered the Iron Fleet to Cersei Lannister and she had taken it, and he had believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who has never seriously been proven wrong about his own importance, that this made him central to whatever came next. The Night King had taken his fleet, crewed it with the dead, and sailed it south. He had not done anything with Euron Greyjoy, had not killed him, had not raised him, had simply moved the fleet away and left him in the water, which was the kind of dismissal that only made sense if the thing doing the dismissing did not register his existence as relevant. He sat in the lifeboat. The Iron Fleet circled him with the slow indifference of weather. The sunset sea ran to the horizon in every direction, gray and enormous and absolutely empty of anything that cared. The survivors' inland column reached the Trident mouth as the sun dropped behind the western hills. The river was running high from spring melt, fast, cold, brown with silt. They followed the southern bank east, moving in a long line between the tree cover and the water. Somewhere behind them, along the coast they'd left, blue fire was visible against the darkening sky, a distant line of it, moving north along the shoreline. The Iron Fleet, running the coast, looking for exactly what they'd just abandoned. The sea was closed. The road ahead ran through country that had no guarantee at the other end of it. There was only the river beside them, and the dark coming in, and the Trident somewhere ahead, and the army moved toward it in silence, because silence was what you used when you understood the thing you were running from and had nothing useful to say about it yet. The rubies were still there. You had to know to look for them. They didn't catch the light the way rubies in a jeweler's case did. Didn't announce themselves. 300 years of river current had worked them into the ford's gravel bed, tumbled them among the gray stones until they sat flush with everything around them, and the only way to find them was to crouch at the waterline in the early morning when the angle of light came in low and flat across the shallows and turned everything it touched briefly, privately red. Jon found one on his second morning at the ford. He'd been washing his hands in the shallows. The cold of the Trident at this time of year came up through the wrist and kept going, and his fingers closed on something that didn't have the weight of river stone. He turned it over once. A ruby, rough cut, not much larger than his thumbnail. The gem that had been in Rhaegar Targaryen's armor when Robert Baratheon's warhammer found the breastplate. 300 years of water, and it sat in his palm like it had been waiting. He set it back among the stones. He dried his hands on his cloak. He did not tell anyone about it. The camp occupied both banks of the ford, the Winterfell column on the northern bank, the Riverlands survivors on the southern, the combined force of approximately 13,000 people separated by 40 feet of fast cold water that everyone was crossing freely because division was a luxury that required a future to defend. The Riverlands contingent had found them 2 days into the inland march, 4,800 soldiers, a mixture of levies and Brotherhood fighters, and the remnants of 2 minor lords' household guards, moving north along the Trident's southern bank, looking for exactly what they'd found. No great lord among them. The highest-ranking commander was a knight named Edwin Trant, no relation to the other, who had held the town of Stony Sept for 6 days before the dead drained out of it, and left behind only the people who hadn't been fast enough. He was a competent man. He had steady eyes, and he had kept 4,800 people alive and moving in the right direction, which was a more considerable achievement than it sounded when you understood what the Riverlands had looked like for the past 8 days. The council met on the northern bank, around a fire that was purely for light. The morning was not cold enough to need it, and everyone around it was past feeling cold anyway. Jon stood. Tyrion sat on a log. Dany stood on the opposite side. Sir Edwin and 2 other Riverlands commanders sat close together in the way of people who are representatives without quite knowing what they're representing. Jon looked at Sir Edwin and said, "There's something I need to tell you." Before anything else, Edwin looked at him steadily. "My lord, my name is Aegon Targaryen." Jon said it the way you say something you have considered carefully and decided to say plainly. No preamble, no softening. Rhaegar Targaryen's son, by Lyanna Stark. The marriage was legitimate. The succession is legitimate. I am telling you this because you deserve to know who you're looking at when you decide what to do next. He paused. I'm not telling you because I want the Iron Throne. I don't think the Iron Throne exists in any meaningful sense anymore. I'm telling you because I have Valyrian steel and 2 living dragons and a specific plan for how to end this, and you should know the full accounting before you decide whether to follow it. Edwin was quiet for a moment. He looked at Jon. He looked at the 2 dragons visible in the gray morning sky above the southern tree line. Unmistakable shapes. Nothing else in the world moved like that. He looked at the 7,400 people on the northern bank who had walked from Winterfell in 8 days and were still. Improbably, organized, what's the plan? Edwin said. The intelligence rider came in at midday, pushing a horse that needed 3 days of rest and grain it wasn't going to get. He had ridden from the western Westerlands with a message from a maester in Lannisport who had been gathering information the way maesters gathered information, methodically, from every source that still existed, compiling the picture into something legible. The dead had not marched from King's Landing. That was the core of it. 8 days since the city fell, and the million-strong army inside its walls had not advanced in any direction. No movement north along the King's Road. No movement east into the Crownlands. The Iron Fleet was operating in coastal waters. Yes, the report confirmed what they already knew about the sea route being closed, but the land army was stationary. Inside the city. Behind the walls. Tyrion turned this over in his hands for a while, sitting by the midday fire with the report in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance. He's waiting, he said finally. For what? Dany said. For us to come to him. For exactly what we're currently being forced toward. He set the report down. Consider his position. He has the most defensible location in Westeros. 1 million soldiers. Walls that survived Stannis' assault and Cersei's wildfire. A navy controlling the sea approach. The living cannot wait him out. We're running out of ground and food and time simultaneously. He doesn't need to march north and harvest the Riverlands when the Riverlands will eventually come to him out of necessity. He is, Tyrion said, not for the first time, thinking more clearly than we are. Then we go to him on our terms, Jon said. We choose the moment. We choose the entry. There is no good entry into a city of 1 million wights. There's a better one than the front gate. He had been carrying Bran's intelligence since the Gods' Wood at Winterfell, the Night King in the throne room, stationary, waiting at the center of everything he had taken. A general who holds the center and waits for the assault to come is a general who has already chosen his ground. Jon had spent 8 days working out how to make that certainty into a weakness. Bran confirmed his location before we left Winterfell, Jon said. He walked to the Red Keep. He went to the throne room. He has been there since the city fell. He let that sit for a moment. He is one being in one room. He is not the army is the consequence of him. Kill the source, and the chain breaks. We've seen it work. We know the mechanics. Getting inside a walled city of 1 million wights to reach that one room, Tyrion said, is what Davos is going to explain. Dany found Tyrion at the water's edge as the light was going. She had been carrying something since the council that morning, not the announcement of Jon's identity, which she had been prepared for, but the moment after it. When Edwin had asked about the plan and Jon had answered, and the Riverlands commanders had leaned in and begun to believe in something, she had watched it happen from the other side of the fire. She had felt it. She sat beside Tyrion on the bank and said, I spent 20 years believing the Iron Throne was the answer to everything. I know, he said. Not just the answer to my family's exile. The answer to the realm's problems. If the right person sat in the right chair, the rest would follow. Order, stability, justice. It just required the right person. She looked at the water. I was certain I was the right person. You may have been. The chair is slag. The city is a grave. She picked up a stone and turned it over without throwing it. I keep waiting to feel the loss of it, and I don't. I feel other things. Not that. Tyrion looked at her sideways. "What do you feel?" She was quiet for a moment. "I feel like I want to burn him," she said. "The Night King. Not for the throne, not for the succession, not for any of the reasons I told myself I was coming to Westeros. Just because he killed 1,000,000 people, and I have fire, and I want to use it for that." She turned the stone in her fingers. "I'm not sure what to do with a purpose that simple." "Simple purposes," Tyrion said, "have the considerable advantage of being true." She threw the stone. It skipped twice and went under. She stood and brushed off her hands and went back to the camp without saying anything else, which was its own kind of answer. Jon sat with the problem late into the evening, after the councils and the riders and the logistics of combining two forces into one unit that could move and eat and fight had been sorted enough to allow for something resembling thought. He sat at the fire with a cup of water he wasn't drinking and turned the plan over the way you turn a stone looking for the weak side. The dragons gave them the distraction. Drogon and Rhaegal circling the city's outer walls, forcing the Night King to manage an aerial threat that drew his attention upward and outward. While the walls were the focus, a small team went in from below. The smuggler's tunnel Davos had described, the one running from the bay into the lower city, the one the dead appeared not to use when Davos had last moved through it, for reasons that might hold and might not. 8 people in. The tunnel was a straight run, roughly. The city was 1,000,000 wights who moved in patterns, and patterns had gaps. And gaps were navigable by the kind of person who had spent years learning to move through spaces where being found meant dying. He thought of Arya. He did not know where she was. She had left Winterfell 4 days before the breakout. She had 8 days on them already, traveling alone at the speed she traveled when she had decided on a direction. She could be in the Riverlands. She could be at King's Landing. He thought of what she'd said in the armory. "I'll be in King's Landing before you reach the Trident." He had not entirely believed her at the time. He believed her now. If she was inside the city already, if she had found the tunnel, or another way in, and had spent days mapping white movements the way she mapped everything else, then the plan was not about sending someone into the unknown. It was about arriving where she already was. He sat with that for a while. Around him the camp settled into its nighttime rhythm. Guards rotated. Fires held. 13,000 people breathing in the dark above the river that ran over a dead man's rubies. Somewhere to the south, at a distance of 8 days' march, 1,000,000 dead things stood in a walled city waiting with the patience of something that had learned to wait during the age when men still lived in caves. Jon set down the cup. He found Sir Edwin at first light and they began working through the mechanics. The combined force would march south at midday. The King's Road was faster, but the approach routes through the Crown Lands offered more cover, and Tyrion had identified 3 positions along the eastern road where the terrain favored a force that needed to stop and not be found. They would reach the city in 8 days if the march held. At the fire, Tyrion briefed the Riverlands commanders. Grey Worm ran supply assessments with the same unsullied precision he ran everything. Davos sketched what he remembered of the tunnel from a visit 30 years prior, cross-referencing with the composite description Tyrion had assembled from old port records and 2 former Crown Harbor officials who were in the Riverlands contingent and remembered things. Dany stood outside the briefing, looking south, already working out the angles. At midday the column moved. 13,000 people, 2 dragons, 1 sword of Valyrian steel, and a plan that required everything to work in a sequence and still might not be enough, turning south on the road away from the Ruby Ford. The morning light had found the river shallows one last time before they left. That low, flat angle that made the stones glow briefly. The rubies caught it and held it and gave it back. Nobody stopped to look. There was no time to stop. The dead were in the south, waiting. The living went to meet them. The smell reached them at 10 miles. It was not the smell of fire or rot in any form Jon had encountered before, and he had encountered both in quantities that should have prepared him for most variations. This was something the nose did not have adequate vocabulary for, a sweetness first, sitting at the top of the breath, the kind of sweetness that belonged to fruit left too long in heat, but beneath it something heavier, mineral. The smell of matter in a process his body recognized without being able to name. It coated the back of the throat. It did not leave when you breathed through your mouth instead. The soldiers around him noticed it at roughly the same moment, a ripple of hands going to cloths, to cloaks, to whatever fabric was available, and then they walked through it, because there was nowhere else to walk. At 5 miles, the sound stopped. That was how they knew they were close before the city appeared, not by sight, not by increased smell, but by the cessation of something they hadn't noticed they'd been hearing, until it ended. The Crownlands Road ran through farmland and small copses of tree that should have held bird sound, wind and grass sound. The ambient noise of countryside that did not know a war was happening. It had held those sounds for 16 days of marching, faint but present. At 5 miles south of the Blackwater Rush, the sound stopped completely. No birds, no wind, though the air was still moving. No insects, nothing with a living register anywhere in the acoustic field. The columns slowed, without being ordered to slow. The front ranks simply stopped moving at full pace, and the slowdown passed backward like a wave, the way things moved through 13,000 people when the thing at the front changed. Jon walked to the head of the column and kept moving. They reached the ridge above the Blackwater Rush as the sun peaked, a long elevated approach that gave them the first full view of the city from the south. 2 miles distant across the river, Jon stopped. Beside him, Tyrion stopped. Davos, who had been making notes on a small piece of leather since dawn, stopped with his stylus halfway through a letter and did not complete it. King's Landing was intact. That was the first and most disorienting thing. The walls stood. Every tower stood. The Red Keep on Aegon's high hill rose above the skyline exactly as it always had, the mass of it unchanged, the towers catching the midday light the way they had caught it for 300 years. From this distance, from this angle, you could have believed the city was simply having a quiet day. The harbor was still, every ship at anchor, no sails moving. The gates were closed. The Blackwater Rush ran beneath the city's southern walls with the same cold indifference it had always had for whoever lived above it. The battlements were full, not with soldiers, not with anything carrying weapons or showing any visible organization of the kind soldiers showed. Every rampart, from the harbor gate to the far western drum towers, held figures standing shoulder to shoulder in absolute stillness, looking south. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. The battlement density was wrong for a garrison. You couldn't fit that many bodies on a functioning fighting platform unless fighting was no longer the point, unless the bodies were there purely to fill space, to stand, to wait. Which they were. Dany was in the air within 20 minutes of the column halting. She took Drogon low enough over the walls to draw attention without entering range of anything that might still be functional on the ramparts, circled the entire perimeter at that altitude, and came back with her report delivered flat and fast and accurate, the way she reported things when she was keeping herself away from the feeling of them. The gates were sealed from inside. The white density on the walls was highest at the 3 main gates and the harbor entrance, packed so tightly that individual figures were indistinguishable, a solid mass of blue-eyed dead. The interior streets were visible in sections from altitude and were similarly packed. The Red Keep showed no movement on its outer defenses beyond the standard white presence. Viserion was not visible on any pass, not on the walls, not in the air, not on any roof large enough to hold him. He was inside the city somewhere, or beneath it, or the Night King had him deployed somewhere she hadn't overflown. "He's in the throne room," Jon said. "Bran confirmed it before we left Winterfell. He walked there when the city fell and hasn't moved since." Dany looked at him. "You're sure of Bran's read on this? Bran is rarely wrong about where something is, only about whether telling you matters." He looked at the city across the water. "The question is how we reach him." They found Tyrion's map rock, a flat section of the ridge with enough level surface to unroll the chart without it curling at the edges, and they stood around it and went through the options in the order that they failed. A siege from outside failed because the dead needed nothing a siege denied. Food, irrelevant. Water, irrelevant. The living, conversely, had 8 days of supplies at full ration and were 1,800 miles from the nearest functional supply line. The arithmetic of a waiting contest between the living and the dead went in one direction only. A full dragon assault failed because fire, while it killed wights, could not kill enough wights to matter. 1,000,000 wights at full dragon assault density, both Drogon and Rhaegal burning continuously for as long as they could sustain it, might clear 30,000 in a single pass. An hour's worth of work for the Night King to replace from the city's population. The math required 30-plus sustained passes over multiple days. Before the second pass, Viserion would be in the air. And a full assault burned the city, burned potential survivors hiding inside, burned the food stores in the Street of Flour, burned the structures that the living would need to rebuild anything from if they survived this. It handed the Night King a victory even in its success. "Small team," Jon said. He said it before Tyrion could assemble the argument toward it, because he had been assembling it himself for 8 days, and he knew where it arrived. Kill the Night King, everything stops. That's how it works. We've confirmed it works that way. We've seen the ripple when a White Walker dies. Kill the source, the chain breaks. We don't need to defeat 1,000,000 soldiers. We need to reach one man. One man in the center of a walled city defended by those 1,000,000 soldiers, Tyrion said. Which is impossible if we try to fight through it. Possible if we go under it. Davos had been waiting for this. He had been waiting with the patience of someone who had information that would be needed eventually, and had learned long ago that presenting information before the room was ready for it was the same as not presenting it. He unrolled a smaller piece of leather beside the main map, his own notes. Accumulated over 8 days of conversation with every former King's Landing resident in the column who was willing to talk about the lower city's geography. Smuggler's Tunnel, Davos said. Runs from the outer edge of Blackwater Bay. There's a cave system beneath the cliffs, accessible at low tide from the water's surface into the sub-basement of the lower city. Comes up in Flea Bottom, in the cellar of a building that used to be a pot shop and may or may not still be standing. He traced the route with one finger. I ran this tunnel 3 times in my life. Once with a cargo of pepper, once with a Myrish nobleman who had reason to enter King's Landing without being seen, and once because I needed to leave it very quickly and the gate option was unavailable. It floods in the middle section at high tide, waist deep. At low tide it is unpleasant, but passable. The ceiling is low in 2 places. He paused, choosing his next words with care. When I used it, the dead things I saw in the harbor district did not wade out into water that rose above their knees. They stopped at the edge. Whether that holds true for a flooded tunnel I can't promise you. I've never seen a wight in a tunnel before. But everything I've watched them do suggests they do not choose standing water without reason. That is the best read I can give you, and the tunnel is the best option I have. It may be wrong, Jon said. It may be wrong, Davos agreed. But a maybe in a tunnel beats a certainty at the gate. The plan took the rest of the afternoon to assemble and another 2 hours to explain to the people who needed to execute parts of it. Dany and Drogon and Rhaegal unmounted, driven south by Dany's signal, would circle the outer walls beginning 30 minutes before the tunnel team entered the water. Low and aggressive, forcing the white formations on the ramparts to respond, drawing the Night King's management outward and upward. While the walls were the operational concern, 8 people would go through the tunnel, surface in Flea Bottom, and reach the Red Keep by the routes Davos had mapped and Arya, if she was there, had spent 8 days learning. 8 people. The number had a logic to it that was also a kind of sentence. Jon was walking the route one more time in his mind, the approach to the tunnel mouth, the low tide timing, the surface point in the cellar, the sequence of streets north to the keep. When he passed the low wall at the edge of the camp nearest the river. The wights on the far bank were visible from here. They had occupied the southern road in the Crownlands, a dense formation, facing the column, not advancing, simply present. The same containment logic the distraction force outside Winterfell had used. These ones were closer. 200 yards of river between them and the nearest Lannister soldier. One of them was small. Jon stopped walking. He stood at the low wall and looked. The wight was in the 3rd row, not at the front, simply in the formation the way all the others were in the formation, placed there by whatever organizing principle the Night King used to deploy them. It was wearing the clothes it had died in. The proportions were wrong for an adult. It was holding something in one hand at its side, a small shape, square, the size of something a child carried. A wooden toy. He could see the painted colors on it, faded and river damp, from this distance. He looked at it for a long time. One toy. One child. That was the number that carried the weight of 1,000,000, not the million, which was too large to hold, but the one. The specific one. The painted colors on a piece of wood carried by something that used to be someone's whole world. He turned away from the wall and went to find his team. At low tide, 2 hours before midnight, Dany took Drogon up and banked south. The roar of dragon fire hit the outer walls in a long sustained burst that lit the river orange from a mile in every direction. On the ramparts, 10,000 wights turned toward the sound and the light. Jon went into the tunnel. The water was cold in the way that water was cold when it came from underground, not the cold of weather, which had a surface, but the cold of stone and depth, which went all the way through. It came up to his chest in the middle section. He kept moving. Behind him, 7 others kept moving. The ceiling dripped. The tunnel was absolute dark, torches were not an option. The dead followed light. They moved on feel and memory, and Davos's voice ahead of them counting his steps from the last time he'd been here, 30 years ago, in a different world. Forward, in the cold, toward the center of the dead city. Behind them the water closed over their entry point, and the tunnel held its dark. Davos counted steps. He said the numbers quietly, barely above a breath, his voice absorbed by the tunnel walls before it could travel. 40, 41, 42. The sound of the water was constant, not flowing water, standing water, the kind that settled and went still and cold in enclosed spaces over years of non-use. It was chest deep in the middle section, and had been for 20 minutes. Every step required lifting the foot completely clear and placing it blind on stone that might be level and might not be, and the 8 of them moved in single file, with one hand on the shoulder of the person ahead, and the other out to the side touching wall, whenever wall was available. Jon's hand on Grey Worm's shoulder. Ghost moving somewhere behind him, silent as always. The direwolf had taken to water with neither enthusiasm nor complaint, simply adjusting his movement the way he adjusted everything, by being exactly as competent as the situation required. The cold, at this depth, had no surface. It was not weather cold. It came up through the floor of the tunnel and through the standing water, and into the boots, and through the leather, and into the foot, and kept going, a cold that was interested in the bone, not the skin. Jon had been cold at the wall for years. This was different. This was the cold of a place that had been this temperature since before anyone living had been born, and intended to remain so after. Davos counted. 91, 92, the water began to drop. Thigh deep. Knee deep. Calf deep. Then stone underfoot without water, slightly slick, angling upward in a grade shallow enough to miss if you weren't feeling for it. The ceiling that had been grazing the tallest heads in the group lifted by 2 feet. Then 3. Davos stopped counting and said, quietly, ladder. The cellar came up around Jon in sections. First the smell, which was old cooking grease and damp wood, and the particular sourness of a space that had been sealed for weeks. Then the creak of a trapdoor. Then gray ambient light from somewhere above that was not torchlight, and not daylight, but something between. The cold blue atmospheric light of a city that had been lit by something other than fire for 16 days. Jon came up last. He stood in what had been a pot shop. The broad, shallow pots still hung on their hooks, coated with something he did not look at closely. The front wall had a window facing the street. He moved to it slowly, keeping below the sill, and looked out. The alley was 12 feet wide. The wights in it were not moving randomly. That was what he had not fully understood from the ridge above the Blackwater Rush, the organization of it. From a distance, a formation looked like density. From 15 feet, it looked like something that had been arranged. The wights in the alley faced outward in 2 deep lines on each side, leaving the center passable, oriented away from the passage. Not guarding it. The dead didn't guard, they didn't hold positions the way soldiers held positions. Because positioning required an understanding of what you were preventing, and dead things didn't understand prevention. But they had been placed. Someone had placed them. They stood where they stood because someone with strategic intelligence had put them there, and they would remain there until that intelligence directed otherwise. Jon was working out the gap, 12 feet of passable center, the pattern of placement, whether the side-facing orientation meant the wights would register lateral movement, when something touched his arm from the left side. He had Longclaw half drawn before he registered the hand. Small, gloved, applying exactly the pressure required to stop him. No more. Arya stepped out of a shadow that had been a shadow a moment ago, and was now a shadow with a person in it, which was the way Arya moved through spaces where moving was dangerous. She looked at him. He looked at her. 8 days since Winterfell. She had dirt on her face that was the specific grime of sustained urban movement, not travel dirt, city dirt, the kind you accumulated moving through alleys and cellars and spaces between walls. Her eyes were steady and completely clear, and showed no evidence that the 8 days had been anything other than work. She kept her voice below the threshold of the nearest wight. They move in 14-minute cycles. The formation reorients, the ones facing the alley turn inward, the ones facing the buildings turn out. There's a 40-second gap where the passage is effectively blind from both sides. She looked past him at the rest of the group. 8 people is too many for the gap. 4 move. Then 4. I'll go first. She paused. He's in the throne room. I've been watching. He hasn't left it in 8 days. The White Walker lieutenants are deployed throughout the keep corridors, 6 of them. They're navigable if you know the spacing. I know the spacing. She had been inside the city for 8 days, alone, mapping this. Jon looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Show us." They lost 1 soldier in the street between the Street of Steel and the Dragon Gate approach, not to a white patrol, but to the ground itself, a section of road above a collapsed cellar that gave way without warning, and took the man down into dark before anyone could reach him. The sound he made lasted 2 seconds. The wights in the nearest formation turned toward it, and Jon's team pressed against the wall and held completely still for 40 seconds, while the dead sorted through the response to a sound that had already ended. Then the wights reoriented, and Jon's team moved. The red keep gates stood open. The dead didn't use gates. Jon moved through them at the same pace he'd been moving through the city. Measured, deliberate, the pace that looked like confidence and was actually the product of understanding that running attracted more response than walking. Grey Worm took the first lieutenant, a White Walker that materialized from a side corridor with its ice blade already moving, with Longclaw from Jon's hand, a blade pass that Jon had signaled 3 steps ahead of execution. The walker shattered. The sound of it was like a window breaking in a cold room, sudden, specific, gone. The second and third they moved around by Arya's route, through a service passage that ran parallel to the main corridor and connected to the kitchens, then up a servant stair to the gallery level above the throne room. The remaining 3 walkers were deployed in the wings they weren't entering. At the top of the stair, Arya stopped. She looked at Jon. He looked at her. She moved her fingers in a brief sequence that she had explained in the cellar, the entry positions, the sight lines, the placement she'd identified over 8 days of watching. He understood it completely. She had spent 8 days building a plan that required exactly 2 people, and had known, without confirmation, that he would be one of them. She went first, through a narrow door at gallery level, down to a position behind the throne dais that was deep in shadow, and had been deep in shadow every day she had scouted it. He gave her 30 seconds. Then he walked through the main doors of the throne room. The Night King was not facing the door. He stood before the Iron Throne with his back to the entrance, and the throne behind him sagged in its corner of the room. One arm drooped fully now, 3 feet of fused sword steel hanging at a 40-degree angle from where it should have been. The surrounding swords bleeding into each other where the heat had reached deep enough and stayed long enough. What remained still recognizably aspired to the shape a throne made. It was not a throne anymore. It was a ruin that remembered being a throne, which was something different. The Night King turned, not because he heard Jon enter, not because Jon's footstep reached him across 60 feet of stone floor. He turned because he had known since the second hour in the tunnel, had known with whatever the function was that passed for awareness in something that ancient, and had allowed the approach because this moment was the point. He had not had the dead collapse the tunnel, or flood the cellar, or take them in the streets because he had wanted this. He was the death that waited to be found, and it had been found. The cold came off him in a wave. Not metaphorically, the temperature in the throne room dropped by 15 degrees as he turned. A physical, measurable drop that Jon felt as pressure more than cold. The way you feel depth change underwater. His breath misted. His hands, wrapped around Longclaw's grip, registered the change in the metal immediately, Valyrian steel conducting the cold inward, his fingers beginning to lose the precise sensitivity that grip required. Jon attacked. He attacked because waiting was dying. He covered the 60 feet in 9 strides and drove Longclaw at the Night King's midsection, with everything he'd built since the Wall. The years of fighting in cold and dark and outnumbered. The specific muscle memory of a body, trained to keep working past the point where it should stop. The Night King caught the blade barehanded. Not the edge, he closed his hand around the flat of the blade below the crossguard, the Valyrian steel going white with cold at the contact point, frost crystallizing upward along the fuller toward Jon's grip. He held it. Jon pushed. The Night King did not move backward by a single inch. He held the blade and looked at Jon with those ancient eyes that held no anger, no triumph. Nothing that required an audience, and he twisted his wrist. Jon felt 3 fingers on his right hand stop working. He released the grip before he lost the whole hand, stepped back, kept his feet. The floor was frosting over at the Night King's radius, the stone going slick. He had no sword. His hand was partially numb and reforming its function slowly. The Night King raised his own hand, and in the corridor behind the throne Jon could hear the dead beginning to move toward the sound of presence. He had maybe 90 seconds. So he charged again. Not because it would work differently, because the only thing that mattered in the next 90 seconds was that the Night King's attention stayed on the thing in front of him and not on anything else in the room. The Night King hit him across the chest with an open hand, and Jon went backward into the stone floor hard enough to blank his vision for 2 full seconds. He got his arms under him. He pushed. He got one knee up. He looked at the Night King from the floor, from 10 feet away, and the Night King looked back at him with absolute patience, absolute cold. The ancient thing that had been doing this since before the Wall was built and intended to be doing it still when the Wall was memory. Jon kept his eyes on those eyes. He did not look at the shadow on his left side. He did not look at the darkness behind the throne dais. He held the Night King's gaze with everything he had and got his feet under him. The catspaw blade came from the left. Arya had been in position since before Jon entered the room. 8 days of watching had given her the sightlines and the angles, and the specific understanding that the Night King registered threats from the direction of his attention, and was slower to process what arrived from the direction of nothing. He sensed her in the last half-second. His head moved, his weight shifted. And in the gap between sensing and reacting, Jon's movement from the floor pulled his focus back for the single instant it required, and Arya's hand drove the Valyrian steel blade upward. The Night King did not make a sound. He went still. Completely still, in the way that things go still when the animating principle departs rather than when the body fails. The blue light in his eyes held for 1 breath, then 2. Then it was simply gone. Not fading, gone, like a fire that runs out of fuel between 1 second and the next. He came apart from the center outward. Not dramatically, not in an explosion of ice or a column of light. He simply ceased to hold together, the way something very old ceases to hold together when the last thing keeping it coherent is removed. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then outside the walls of the Red Keep, in the streets of King's Landing, the dead began to fall. It moved outward from the throne room, like a wave from a stone dropped in still water. The wights in the corridors dropping first, then the keep courtyard, then the surrounding streets, then the districts outward toward the harbor, the falling spreading district by district through the city, in a ripple that took 90 seconds to reach the walls and cross the water and continue into the crownlands beyond. The formations on the ramparts simply stopped standing. 10,000 bodies on the walls went down at once, the sound of it reaching the camp on the ridge as a low continuous percussion that lasted for 20 seconds and then ended. On Drogon's back, circling the outer walls, Dany watched it happen from above. She watched the wights on the northern ramparts fall first, then the wave of it spreading outward from the keep. The organized dead becoming disorganized and then horizontal, in a sequence that moved too fast and too perfectly to be anything other than a single cause with a million effects. The city went quiet. Not the quiet of waiting. A different quality entirely. The quiet of something that is ended, rather than something that is between moments. She brought Drogon down in the central square and sat for a moment on his back without dismounting, listening to it. 1,800 miles north, on the ramparts of Winterfell, Sansa watched 50,000 wights collapse in the snow. The northern tree line held them for a moment, or seemed to, the shapes still standing against the dark, and then they went down in a sequence that moved from east to west across her field of vision, every dead thing in the army losing the thread simultaneously and falling where it stood. The snow around Winterfell's walls was thick with them, dark shapes against the white. She stood at the rampart for a moment. Then she turned and walked down to the signal fire and lit it with her own hands. In the throne room, Jon sat on the floor with his back against the base of the throne dais and looked at where the Night King had been. Nothing remained. The frost on the stone was already retreating, the room's ambient temperature rising by degrees as the cold that had come off that presence dispersed. Arya sat 8 feet away on the steps of the dais, her legs crossed, the cat's paw blade resting across her knees. She was looking at nothing in particular. She had the expression of someone who has been holding a task in the front of their mind for 8 days and has just completed it and is waiting for the next thing to arrive. Jon looked at her for a moment. Then he got to his feet. Slowly, his chest where the Night King had hit him registering its objection through 3 separate points of pain, and crossed to where she sat and put his hand on her head. She let him. She closed her eyes for a moment and said nothing, and he said nothing, and outside the throne room the dead city was finally, completely still. The smell changed overnight, the cold that had come off the Night King, not weather cold, the specific cold of something that should not have existed, that had been holding back the natural order of things by its presence alone, withdrew from the city the moment he ceased to be, and what rushed in to replace it was the smell of what a million bodies actually were, without the cold, to preserve them. It came on fast. By the time dawn light reached the tops of the Red Keep's towers, it was present in the air at every depth. Not just the top of the breath, but all the way down, sitting in the lungs, coating everything. It was what it was. There was no adequate response to it except to breathe through it and move. Jon came out of the Red Keep's main entrance as the first light touched the city. He stood on the steps and looked at the square below him, the wide, paved expanse that had been the gathering point for coronations and executions and the ordinary commerce of 300 years of capital life. It was covered in bodies, not in rows, not in any organized configuration, just the shapes of things that had been standing and were now horizontal, in exactly the positions they'd been standing in when the thread broke. Tens of thousands of them in this square alone, and the squares beyond, and the streets beyond those, and the districts beyond those, all the way to the harbor and the walls and the Blackwater Rush. Dany found him on the steps. She had brought Drogon down in the square an hour ago and walked the last distance. She was on foot, which felt significant, though neither of them could have said why. She came up the steps and stood beside him and looked at the same square and said nothing for a while. How many of them were alive when the city fell? She said eventually. Not a question she expected him to answer. Not a question with an answer available. Some, he said. There might be survivors still inside, in sealed rooms in the tunnels. He looked at the buildings surrounding the square. The windows were dark. We look, she nodded. We look. They found each other's hands briefly and then let go, because there was work, and the work needed doing. Tyrion sat on a block of stone at the edge of the square with a piece of charcoal and a flat piece of leather, and did what he always did when the fighting was done and the counting had to start. He had been doing it since first light, compiling the columns from every report the runners brought him as the army entered the city through the open gates. His handwriting was small and precise, and he wrote without pausing, because pausing meant thinking about what the numbers meant rather than what they were, and right now what they were was the more useful information. Living, approximately 7,200 from the Winterfell breakout, 4,800 Riverlands, the tunnel team -1, Dany, 2 living dragons. The Winterfell garrison under Sansa, he didn't have that count yet, but the raven from the signal fire had arrived an hour ago, confirming it was lit, which meant Sansa was alive and the garrison was alive, and that was enough for now. The dead? He stopped writing for a moment. Set the charcoal down. Picked it back up. The dead were a number that had no column large enough to hold it. He moved past it to the things that could be acted on. The Westerlands untouched. The Vale untouched. The Reach untouched. Dorne untouched. Millions of people still alive in Westeros in territories the Night King's army had never reached. Because the Night King had not marched from King's Landing, had waited for the living to come to him, and the living had gone around him. Those millions were still there. They could be reached. The world could be rebuilt from what they were, if the people doing the building made correct decisions about where to start. He wrote that down too. Then, he went to find Jon. Jon went to the throne room alone. He told no one he was going. He walked the corridors of the Red Keep in the early morning light, past the place in the corridor where the first White Walker had shattered the night before, up the familiar geography of a building he had never lived in and somehow knew anyway, from Bran's account, from Arya's 8 days of scouting. From the way places you have heard about in detail have a partial existence in the mind before you ever reach them. The throne room doors were still open. He went through. The room was large and cold and smelled of the same ash that everything in the city smelled of now, and the high windows let in the morning light in long, slanted columns that caught the dust still moving in the air. The dust had been moving since Viserion's first pass. It would take days to settle. The Iron Throne was in its corner. He stood before it. One arm had come fully away from the body of the throne, not fallen, exactly, but drooped to its full downward extent and taken the swords beneath it with it, the steel flowing together in a mass that had cooled back into solidity, but at a new angle. Fused into a shape that referenced the original without replicating it. The other arm held, but leaned. The swords of the seat were warped out of true, bowing outward at the center where the heat had found the weakest geometry. It was still recognizably a throne, the way a collapsed building was still recognizably a building, by the memory of what it had been, not by what it currently was. Jon thought about the men who had fought to sit in it, every war the throne had ever started or sustained or required, every name lost to those wars, every village emptied by the armies that moved through the countryside in service of the question of who would occupy this specific room. The throne had been forged from conquered enemies' swords by dragonfire, the violence of its making encoded into its material. It had always been comfortable for no one. It had always been worth everything to someone. These two facts had coexisted for 3 centuries without either one correcting the other. He walked past it. He did not touch it. He walked past it and out through the side door that opened onto the gallery above the courtyard. And he stood in the morning air and looked at the city below him and breathed. Dany found him there an hour later. She leaned on the gallery rail beside him, and they looked down at the courtyard, where the Unsullied had already begun the work, the organized, methodical, enormously necessary work of clearing the dead. It would take weeks. Every district, every street and alley and building. The Unsullied worked without comment, without ceremony, with the focused competence they brought to every task. The smoke from the first pyres was already rising at the harbor edge. "What happens now?" she said. He thought about it properly before answering. Not the tactical answer, not the logistics answer. The actual answer. "People need somewhere to go," he said, "and something to go toward. Not a throne. Something else." He looked at the rising smoke. "The Riverlands lords are outside the walls. There are surviving lords in the Westerlands. The Vale, the Reach, Dorne. They'll need to meet somewhere, make decisions about what comes next. Tyrion has a recommendation. Harrenhal. He thinks it's the right kind of wrong, big enough, central enough, cursed enough that nobody wants to claim it as a seat of personal power, just a place to meet." She was quiet for a moment. "And you? What do you want?" He considered the question. The honest answer was that he wanted to sleep for a week, and then spend time in the north where the air was cold and clean, and the problems were the manageable kind. But beneath that was a more complicated truth that deserved a real answer. "I want the people who died here to have been the last ones who die for a chair," he said. "That's what I want." She looked at him. Then she looked out at the city. Then she said, "Then let's make that true." Sansa arrived on day 20. She came through the northern gate with 480 of the 500 soldiers she'd held Winterfell with, 20 lost in the first week to a white patrol that had tested the outer gate before the Night King's death made the point moot. She had brought grain and medical supplies from Winterfell's stores, loaded onto every cart the castle owned. She had organized the column's movement herself, departing within 6 hours of the signal fire confirming King's Landing was clear, moving at a pace that covered the distance in 3 days faster than the estimate said was possible. Jon met her at the gate. They stood in the road outside the city's northern entrance and looked at each other in the midday light. And everything that had been unresolved when she'd stayed and he'd gone, everything that had been exchanged without language in the war room when the goodbye happened, was either resolved by what had happened in the intervening days or simply reclassified as unnecessary. Either worked. She looked past him at the city. At the walls. At the smoke still rising from the pyres that had been burning for 3 days. "Is it clean enough to enter?" she said. "The northern districts are passable. The harbor is still being cleared." She nodded. She looked at the walls for another moment with the expression she used when she was deciding something important. "Build it somewhere better," she said. "Wherever the next one goes. Don't rebuild here. This city has carried the weight of everything people did to each other for 300 years. Put it down. Build somewhere better." She was correct. He had known she would be. The Iron Throne was removed 12 days after the Night King's death. Not by royal decree. There was no royal decree. There was no king. There was a temporary council at Harrenhal that was debating a structure that had not been invented yet and would not be ready for months. Davos found a mason in the Riverlands contingent who assessed the job practically and asked only where the steel should go. It went to the harbor, where smiths were already working on tools for rebuilding. The warped metal was remelted and poured into molds for agricultural implements, mattocks, plowshares, hinge plates. The steel that had been swords, that had been a throne, became the steel that worked ground. The wildfire caches came next. Dany took Drogon through the network Qyburn had partially mapped, and some that Tyrion had found in the Red Keep's records, burning each one deliberately at altitude where the explosion was contained. The green columns rose over the city for 3 days, visible from 30 miles, and when they were done the ground beneath King's Landing was clean for the first time in its history. Jon refused the title of king at the Harrenhal Council. He said it plainly, without drama, without extensive explanation. He had Valyrian steel and the knowledge of what had happened and was willing to speak it to any council that needed to hear it. He did not need a title for any of those things. What he said he would accept was a responsibility without end date, to be present when presence mattered, to hold what needed holding, to step away when things no longer required it. The council debated the name for what that was for 3 days, and arrived at something temporary and honest and good enough to start with, which was the best any title had ever been. Dany took no title. She was Daenerys of House Targaryen, and she had a living dragon, and she had crossed a sea and spent 20 years believing in something that turned out to be the wrong thing, and she was finding out. Slowly, what the right thing might be. It was slower than she was used to. She was getting accustomed to slow. Arya left King's Landing on day 22. She went west, which was the direction she had always been drawn toward, and she went alone, which was the way she moved. She left before anyone was awake. She did not leave a note. She had said what she needed to say in the throne room, with her hand on Jon's under his hand on her head, and she had said it without words, which was the Arya Stark method. He did not try to stop her. He stood at the gate and watched her go until the road bent west and the trees took her, and then he went back inside. The pyres burned for 3 weeks. The smoke was visible across the Crownlands and down into the Reach, and on clear days, from the heights of Storm's End. It smelled of what it was, which was loss, and the living breathed it and kept working, because that was what the living did. On the road north from King's Landing, on a morning 6 weeks after the night, in the tunnel, a traveler coming south would have encountered something they had not seen in a generation. The road full. Not with soldiers. Not with refugees, exactly. Not with people carrying everything they owned and the look of people who did not know where they were going. With people who knew where they were going. Families returning to Riverland's villages that still stood. Merchants moving south with supplies that were needed. Builders heading toward the capital or away from it toward the newer settlements, springing up in the cleared land east of the Trident. Old people who remembered what the realm had been. Children who didn't, and were therefore less frightened of what it might become. 2 dragons moved in the sky above the far hills, circling on the morning thermals. They were visible from 10 miles, which meant that anyone looking south from the road could see them, dark shapes against the blue, riding the air with the ease of things that had been built for exactly this and nothing else. The Game of Thrones was over. The throne was ash. The kingdom that replaced it had no name yet. Only people, tired, alive, and still moving forward. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.